And so now it's a great pleasure to introduce one of our well-known colleagues from the campus, Dr. Stuart Smyth. And Stuart is an assistant professor in the Department of Agriculture and Resource Economics here at the University of Saskatchewan. And he holds the Industry Research Chair in Agri-Food Innovation. His research focuses on sustainability, agricultural innovation and food. And his contributions to the PERC project have been around risk-based decisions and the regulation of new crop varieties and new crop technologies. And today he's going to talk about a topic that I think is close and dear to many of our hearts: pathways and barriers to adoption of new breeding technologies. Stuart.
Thank you, Morris. What I'm going to be talking to you about today is looking at what are some of the we've seen a lot about the science and the innovations that have the potential of coming out of some of not only this project, but a lot of public and private research across not only Canada, the States, Australia. What are some of the potential barriers to actually commercializing these technologies? So what we've done is, as part of this project, is we've launched an expert survey going right back to the start of this project. So we put together an international panel of about 700 individuals from around the world. We have somewhere between 100 and 175 to 200 people responding to each one of these surveys when we send them out about every 3 or 4 months. And you can just see a quick run through. And so what I'm going to do is cover off the results from surveys 4 through 8 a little bit. And we've just launched our most recent survey just last month. So when we go back to looking at what some of the regulatory barriers are, you can see here from the list of about a dozen options, the top 6 have nothing to do with the science of genome editing or any of those technologies. It's all political interference in the regulatory system. So we're starting to see these experts, which include plant breeders, both public and private, regulators from the reg agencies, particularly North America, Europe, Australia, Asia, and technology commercializers within some of the private multinationals. And so this starts to really identify where the bottleneck is in the regulatory system. It has nothing to do with the technologies that are being incorporated or applied or utilized within a lab setting. It all comes at that point where it enters into the regulatory system to go through a risk assessment process and then ultimately get commercialization approval from the respective regulatory bodies. So we then probed a little further and said, do you think your domestic or regional government has policies that are in line with your views? And you can see there's a couple of numbers that really stand out in this. Europeans are twice as pessimistic as they are optimistic. So this is exemplified in the recent decision by the European Court of Justice that ultimately came down and said, according to their regulations for transgenic crop varieties, all of the new genome editing mutagenesis has to be treated as transgenic technologies. So it essentially, in late July, killed plant breeding innovation within Europe. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity for us to pirate academics and scientists and grad students from all over Europe because from what I'm hearing, not many of them have much of an interest in pursuing further education or career opportunities where they can't practice the cutting edge science. So I think it's a tremendous, and I actually posted on Twitter, I said it's great news for farmers in North America. And there was an awful lot of European farmers said we have no idea how we're going to compete because we're on the verge of losing a lot of the chemicals that we require to be competitive. And so I think it's a tremendously black day for agriculture over the summer. So we asked them then about what's the likelihood of approvals of genome-edited crops in your region. And here you just see the polar contrast, right? So the rest of the world countries, hugely optimistic. But the question becomes, will this technologies around genome editing be pushed into the same situation for developing countries as GM has. So a lot of African countries and Asian countries have been hesitant to adopt GM crops because they've been told by the EU, and they've seen examples where Canada and the States have tried to export bulk commodities, corn, rice, soybeans, flax, have all had the border to Europe slammed shut when detection of unapproved events is found in Europe. We've got a very good a bulk commodity handling system. So how does a developing country like Kenya or Tanzania or Uganda that has minimal infrastructure in grain handling ever hope to export commodities to Europe and meet their zero tolerance levels? So this becomes a massive problem for functioning international commodity trade, and that gets to be a real concern for developing countries and whether or not their researchers are going to be able to utilize these technologies, because the EU has just sort of slammed the door shut on genome editing. So then we started to probe a little bit about some of the confidence in the scientific side of things and the regulatory side. And you can see here huge differences, right? When we ask people, how many people share your views about the scientific certainty behind these new breeding techniques? It's 3 to 1. But then we ask them, how many people share your views about this in the regulatory community? It's virtually 50-50. So massive difference in confidence in the science to confidence in the regulatory side of things. And here you can see when we asked how many people in the regulatory community share your views, it comes back and reinforces this idea that it's a 50-50, that there's not a lot of confidence in the regulatory system to be grounded in science anymore. We've largely seen that the EU system has completely moved away from science. So since 2003, they decoupled their risk assessment process. So the European Food Safety does the same things that the USDA, EPA, FDA do in the States, Health Canada, the CFIA do up here. EFSA does all that. They're a little bit longer than we are, but they make consistent decisions that they recommend approval for all of these GM events. Yet to get variety approval, it goes to the European Commission and voted on by a committee of the Commission, which is made up of representatives of government ministries across the EU. So in some cases, these ministry representatives are consumer affairs, environment. In a lot of cases, or in very few cases actually, are the representatives from the Ministry of Agriculture. So it's a very political approval system, and in the 15 years since EFSA was set up, they've approved one variety for commercialization in the EU. It was a variety of potato that BASF had submitted. It took 13 years to get regulatory approval, and they never commercialized it because it was an obsolete variety by the time it made through. By comparison, the CFIA and Health Canada has commercialized approved 83 varieties. So 83 to 1. Talk about a system that does not work. And so the big concern is it doesn't work for transgenic. What's that going to mean for genome editing? And this gets to be a real concern. We've seen, the distribution of concerns, right? Where do the concerns lie? So while there's no concern for society within a regulatory system, because that's what the regulatory system is supposed to do, as a thorough risk assessment, assess all of these things. We know that society is going to have substantial concerns about this. We look at their familiarity with the regulatory system. And I think it starts to get interesting when you look over here, when we asked about how flexible is it, just over 50% of people are saying that the regulatory systems in their country are not flexible enough to allow genome editing varieties to enter and move through the system in a timely manner. So the concern becomes here is in talking to some of the companies involved in putting herbicide-tolerant canola varieties, they can get those varieties approved in about 12 months now. The CFIA, Health Canada have been reviewing herbicide-tolerant canola varieties for 25 years. They understand the technology, the genomics behind it, so it's a pretty simple process. However, import approval within the EU takes 4 to 5 years for every new GM variety. So what does this do for genome editing? They've said we're going to treat this as transgenic, so that means that same regulatory approval process just for feed is going to take an additional 4 to 5 years. What's that going to do for public breeders in Canada to use these technologies and have to incur that cost of variety development or variety approval within an EU system that's taking up to 5 years to make these decisions just to be imported for animal feed? So it's a tremendous burden that's being loaded on these new genome editing techniques by a really defunct and political regulatory system within the EU. So we asked about regulations. Is it encouraging? And you can see, half of people are saying it's certainly discouraging innovation within our country. So that gets to be a concern, that the regulatory framework within a lot of the industrial countries that have adopted and been using GM for 20, 25 years, as we move to site-specific mutagenesis, the regulatory systems have not transitioned with the science and are still involved in regulating technologies that really got their origins in the late 80s and early 1990s. We had done a survey this summer, and just under 90% of breeders, public and private in Canada, that responded to our survey indicated that they thought the regulations in Canada around genome editing needed to be reviewed. This one gets to be a real concern. What do you think advocacy groups in your country are doing? So you can see that almost 2/3 of the experts that responded to our survey feel that the science simply does not matter. The environmental groups are spewing this in so many directions, using so many misinformation campaigns, and they're connecting with ministries of the environment, ministries of consumer affairs, and lobbying in them, saying these are the dangers and the harms that could come from genome editing. We just simply don't know anything about it. So yesterday was World Food Day, and then a whole bunch of environmental organizations got together and they called for a global ban on gene drives. So gene drives are used in a lot of applications, but one of the most beneficial impacts is in genetically modified mosquitoes that can treat or reduce exposure to malaria and Zika. Yet these environmental groups have nothing to say about what's the counter plan. We just need to ban the technology and let tens of or hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people die needlessly every year from Zika and malaria when gene drives offer a solution. So it's this political manipulation that is really driving a lot of the regulatory frameworks within the EU. So when GM crops were first commercialized in 1995, the EU accounted for 1/3 of the global private sector ag R&D. Now, the time they were investing around $8 billion globally, so about $2.5 to $2.7 billion was going into Europe as part of the global ag R&D. In 2015, that had dropped to just under 9%. So for every year of their opposition to GM crops, it's cost them 1% of global ag R&D. I've cumulatively estimated that that's cost Europe about $20 billion in lost R&D investment over the last 20 years. And I think this decision by their Court of Justice in late July is going to drive out that remaining 8.5%. It's going to come to Canada, it's going to come to the States, it's going to go to Argentina and Brazil, Australia. So we're really in a good position to start reaping the benefits of Europe's decision and determination to politically regulate and the commercialization of crop varieties. So this really starts to drive a lot of concerns for me, because what it's saying is that there's a perception within the experts that we need to start moving away from science-based regulation. We need to start including some of these socioeconomic issues into our regulatory systems to provide some of that social comfort around the new crops and food products that will come out of this project and research labs, public and private, across the country. Europe is a perfect example of what happens when you move away from a science-based regulatory system and allow socioeconomic issues to come in. You commercialize one variety in 15 years. That will not make any contribution to improving food security in any way, shape, or form if we only commercialize one variety every 15 years. Here are some of the top socioeconomic considerations that our expert group thought could be or should be part of a socioeconomic component to risk assessment. The challenges in some of these as we go down the list. So how do you define a secondary health effect? I've seen environmental groups argue that not only should we have second-order effects, we need to go to fifth and sixth, and in some cases, seventh-order effects before we ever make an approval for an innovative crop variety. Seventh-order effects. In some of these things, like farmers' rights, there's simply no methodology that would exist, or that exists in the literature, that would be capable of doing an assessment. So what these environmental groups are doing is by pushing for these types of effects to be included in a regulatory assessment, is they know there's no methodology, so it acts as a slam dunk barrier to commercialized technologies. Because they say if there's no methodology, you can't do the risk assessment, you can't generate results, and you can't make a conclusion, yes or no. So by putting those types of nebulous issues into a regulatory system means you kill that regulatory system's ability to make any approval decisions. So the further we move away from science-based risk assessment, the more problematic the risk assessment process is going to be, and increasing the likelihood that it'll just constrict further and nothing gets through other than one variety every 15 years. So we asked about some of the research responsibility around some of these new technologies. And you can start to see, over on the right-hand side, how many experts start agreeing that we need to do a better job of communicating more than just the science. Now, the CFIA has opened up a call for comments this summer and into the fall around transparency in the regulatory system. And part of this comes from being pushed by the private companies that are submitting varieties for approval, saying, we want this system to become more transparent. And in talking to the CFIA, they have the perspective that our regulatory system in Canada with plants with novel traits is really working well. But the challenge is they only talk to the private companies. Our university, the University of Saskatchewan, has an unwritten rule that no research will be done using PNTs. And so when I communicated this to the CFIA last fall, they had no idea that PNT research had really stopped within the universities simply due to the trade concerns of mistakenly being tagged as a GM variety. We saw the problem we had with Triffid flax a decade ago, and none of the commodity groups want to go through that cost and the disasters that that had for prairie agriculture. So this gets to be a concern, is that these trade concerns start creeping in, and we need to start moving away from science-based risk assessment processes. So we see a big concern within some of the research we're doing around how are the technologies that are being utilized within the project or have the capability of being utilized. How can we get these varieties commercialized, and what will be the impact for us if we don't? So I'm really concerned that this European decision to treat genome editing as transgenic technologies is going to have a negative impact on R&D in Canada. Because now if you're a public breeder of any cereal or pulse or oil seed that's not one of the staple, canola or corn or soybeans, what incentive would you have to use genome editing if you're uncertain whether or not that product can get approval within the EU system? And have you got funding within a grant or within the university to pay for an additional 4 to 5 years of the cost of obtaining that regulatory approval? So this is a really big concern for our university, for agriculture in the prairies in Canada, is this decision by the EU to treat genome editing as transgenic. And I don't think a lot of people have really grasped what the global implications are going to be around commodity trade, let alone what the implications are going to be for Canadian agriculture if, from a public sector breeding technology, we see breeders moving away from using these technologies to commercialize new varieties. So that's all I had to say today. If you are interested and you're not part of our pool of experts, we'd be more than glad to have you sign up. And you can go to our project website to get a bit of a background and participate. And we've got a poster downstairs. It's poster 51, so feel free to stop by and have a chat. Thank you very much.